Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video called What Americans Don't Understand About Europe. Probably a lot, but let's check it out and comment, like and subscribe.
What is it about Americans and Paris, or Americans and Tuscany, or most recently, apparently, Americans and Mallorca? Many Americans have long romanticized Europe as this jewel of ancient history and culture, but what even is Europe? What do people mean when they talk about it? Where is Poland? What about the Balkans? What about Turkey? Is that still Europe? And the question on everyone's lips, where does Russia fit into this? Isn't Russia also part of Europe as well? I'm originally from the UK. I've been living in Germany for over a decade, and these are some of the questions that I want to explore today, because if you ask 10 Americans to point to Central Europe on a map, you'll get 10 different answers. Most Americans, actually I would say most people in general, like their mental map of Europe, at least people who are not from Europe themselves, it stops at France, Germany, and maybe Spain. Beyond that, it's just all this kind of vague blur of the East or Slavic or somewhere near Ukraine. And woe is the man who makes the mistake of calling a country Eastern Europe. Everyone seems to want to distance themselves from that label, because it's not just a comment on their geography. It's a kind of code for less developed, ex-communist, and many countries want out of that category. Poland sees itself as Central Europe, so does Hungary, Austria, and even parts of Germany. But where does Central Europe end, and where do the Balkans begin? And why does nobody seem to agree? You know, I guess the real question here is, how many Europes are there? It sounds simple enough, but it really isn't. If you ask a geographer, they'll tell you Europe stretches from Iceland in the west to the Ural Mountains in Russia. That's kind of the textbook definition. You know, it's a subcontinent defined by tectonic plates and mountain ranges. But if you ask a politician, they'll probably say something about the EU, meaning the 27 countries with shared laws, open borders, and Brussels breathing down their neck. But then that excludes countries like Norway and Switzerland and Albania, and yes, even parts of the Balkans that desperately want into the EU. Now, if you ask somebody from the UK, you know, depending on their age, of course, you might hear something like fog in the Channel, or Europe is over there somewhere. Like, quite honestly, this video is much for Brits as it is for Americans, because many Brits do not see themselves as being part of Europe at all. If you don't understand this, I did a whole video on it here. You can check it out after this one up here. I'll link it somewhere. So which one is it? Geographical Europe is seemingly clear on paper. Political Europe is in flux, and cultural Europe is completely up for debate. And that's even before we get to emotional Europe. You know, the one people imagine when they dream of sitting in a Parisian cafe, or eating Sachertorte in Vienna, or hiking the Alps, or sailing the Croatian coast. The one Hollywood romanticized for decades, and that just doesn't really actually exist. There's no single definition of Europe. There really are quite a few, and some of them overlap, some contradict each other, and you know, the confusion isn't just semantic. It shapes how nations see themselves and how others see them. And this is why countries like Georgia and Moldova and the Ukraine, they desperately want to be seen as European. And the complexity is increased by the sheer number of languages spoken here and the absence of any official common language across Europe. Learning German has been one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life. So, who belongs where? What is Western, Central, and Eastern Europe? This is where things really start to unravel. Like most Americans, and quite frankly most Brits, they will refer to everything east of Germany as Eastern Europe. Like Poland, Eastern. Hungary, Eastern. Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltics, definitely Eastern Europe. Except they're not. I mean, at least not according to the people who actually live there. Ask a Pole or a Czech or a Slovak where they live, and they will probably say Central Europe. And this is not just a geographic correction, it's a cultural statement. You know, it's a way of saying we're not post-Soviet, we're not Balkan, we're not some eastern outpost of Europe, we're at its very heart. And this matters because, you know, these labels, Western, Eastern, and Central, are never neutral. They always come with baggage. Western Europe has long been synonymous with prosperity, with liberal democracy and modernity. And Eastern Europe still evokes the ideals of communism. It is just the fact that these countries feel different. Like, even just walking around the city of Berlin, you can often feel the difference between West and former East Berlin, even though so much has changed since then. Central Europe tries to sidestep both stereotypes by reclaiming its medieval and Austro-Hungarian legacy, a legacy that predates the Cold War and often complicates the East-West binary even more. So what about the Balkans? Good luck getting a clear answer there. So geographically, the Balkans refer to the southeastern peninsula, countries like Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Bulgaria.
Is Greece the
But
Balkans?
culturally and politically, it's a minefield. Like the term the Balkans was originally used by the Ottomans, which is the Turkish
Wow.
word for mountain, specifically like a chain of wood mountains. And it was
Okay.
never really used by the locals themselves. And so for
Okay.
many in the West, the term Balkan often implies conflict, instability, ethnic tension,
Yeah, because you
largely
couldn't know
due
the
because of
history.
to the wars in the 90s. And so many
Yeah.
people in the region, they really resent this label. Identity there is really complex, and not least of all because the borders have shifted so often.
Yeah.
Like, this is one of the things that makes comparing the US to Europe, as in US states to European countries, totally meaningless, because it's just such a different
Countries.
situation. And then there is,
Yes.
of course, the question of Russia and Turkey. And this is not even about Americans or Brits anymore.
Yeah.
No one can seem to come to a consensus on this. If you ask
What
10
are they?
Europeans if Russia is part of Europe, then you will probably get 10 different answers, each tinged with history, ideology, and it's their own kind of trauma.
think yes,
You
I
just
vote
can't
yes.
get a yes or no answer. It always requires context and a
Correct.
story. Like geographically, the answer is kind of a simple yes. But then again, not really, because only part of Russia, not the
Yeah,
whole of it,
it's
is
half
part
and
of Europe.
half.
Only around 25% of Russia's landmass lies west of the Ural Mountains, which
Only
traditionally
25?
marks the boundary between Europe and Asia. And that portion includes cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. These are cities which culturally have played a huge role in European history. But
Yeah.
politically and psychologically, the question is really anything but simple. You know, for much of modern history, Russia has been Europe's great contradiction. A civilization that gave the West Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, and Dostoevsky, while simultaneously terrifying it with tsars, gulags, and tanks. Russia
God,
has always
yes.
occupied a liminal space. It's
Yes.
just, it's too vast, too authoritarian,
big.
and just too other to be fully European, yet too historically intertwined to be excluded. And so even in the post-Soviet years, its position remained ambiguous. Then came Crimea and the Donbass, and suddenly for much of the
And all
West, the
that.
question wasn't, is Russia part of Europe, but should it be? Today, many Europeans, especially those in the Baltics, Poland, and the Nordics, they reject any notion of a shared European identity with
course.
Russia. The war in Ukraine didn't just redraw borders, it redrew Europe's moral map, and Russia, for
understandable.
many, now sits decisively outside of it.
Yeah.
And then there's Turkey, another borderland nation caught between East and West, culturally rich, militarily strong, and historically enmeshed with Europe through the Ottoman Empire. And Turkey has
Yeah,
long
but-
flirted with the idea of European belonging. It's even been a formal candidate for EU membership since 1999, still not
Really?
been accepted. Because
Yeah,
as
that'd be so
with
weird.
Russia, the question is never just about geography, it's about values. It's about democracy, press freedom, human rights, and whether Turkey's political direction aligns with the EU's evolving identity. And so this is really the crux. Europe is not a neutral geographic concept. It's a story
It's
we tell
true.
about ourselves. And like all stories, it includes and excludes based on who's doing the telling. And so just to boil this
Yes.
down, I would say there are at least 3 different
It's like history belongs to those who live to tell the tale.
Europes, and most people kind of mix them up without realizing it, and that's why there's so much confusion. So there is geographical Europe, political Europe, and cultural Europe. So on paper, Europe is a continent, but it's a strange continent, more like a peninsula than a landmass attached to Asia and sharing the vast Eurasian land plate. And that's why definitions vary. Some exclude the Caucasus nations like Georgia and Armenia, others debate whether Cyprus, closer to Syria and Greece, should even count, and even the
point.
UK, like post-Brexit, is often spoken of as if it just drifted off into the North Atlantic. So geography alone is just not enough to explain Europe.
Yeah.
It's not enough. You have to then go into political Europe,
You need
which is
context.
very confusing. There's the EU, which is the most ambitious political project the world has ever seen, but being
That's
in
right.
Europe doesn't mean being in the EU. Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland
Yeah.
are not EU members, but they are unequivocally European, both in identity and alignment. Meanwhile, you have countries like Turkey and several Balkan states. They have been EU candidates for decades, but
but no dick.
they still haven't
luck.
crossed the threshold into the EU. Then you've got NATO, a separate alliance with its own geography. Turkey is in NATO, but not in the EU. Austria
Yeah.
is in the EU, but not in NATO. Finland and Sweden recently joined. Ukraine wants to join. Russia is doing everything to prevent that from happening. So politics get really very messy very
It
quickly,
is.
and political Europe is very different to geographical Europe. And
Yeah.
finally, there's cultural Europe. Perhaps this is the hardest to define and the most emotionally charged. This is the Europe of Beethoven and Dante, of liberal democracy and secular values, of Christmas markets and university towns and high-speed trains. It's the imagined community that tourists dream of and politicians invoke. But it's also where the deepest tensions lie. You know, everyone talks about the US as being this amazing melting pot of multicultural immigration,
okay.
which, you know, it's not false, but what about the cultural
Not
and
that.
political entity of Europe? Like, nothing like that has ever been tried in the history of the world.
Yes.
Like, the idea that you can just look past years and years of war and destruction and shifting borders, like, that actually goes against human nature, and that is what makes it so special.
Oh my God.
The problem is, who gets
Not
to
human
define
nature.
European values? Is it the bureaucrats in Brussels? Is it the Catholic heartlands of Poland, or is it the post-national elites in Paris and Berlin? When Hungary or Italy moves to restrict migration, are
Yeah.
they defending Europe or are they betraying it? Is Europe Christian? Is it secular? Is it multicultural, postmodern? No one really agrees.
Of
But at
course.
least for the
There's a lot of
moment,
countries.
this is a battle of ideas, not bodies. And that was kind of the whole point of the EU. So if you are American, like, don't worry, you're not alone in finding Europe very confusing. It is just very difficult to define. And everything
Yes.
we've discussed here just makes it so elusive. Like, it's not a single civilization, but a palimpsest, like layer upon layer of contradiction. You know, you've got Catholic
There's
and
a lot of
Protestant,
contradictions.
Latin and Slavic, liberal and authoritarian. It's a place where boundaries have shifted so often that some villagers have changed countries several times without
especially
ever
Baltics.
knowing. And yet there is something distinctly European in the very awareness of these contradictions, like the ability to hold multiple identities in tension. The very idea that you can go supranational is very European. Like, no one else has even conceived of trying to attempt this. Like, we'll obviously see what happens if it actually works, but like, to sit in a cafe in Paris and critique the entire system in 5 languages with 3 passports in your back pocket, that is the very essence. The very idea of Europe is, and I think always has been, a debate. Like, that's what makes it so frustrating to outsiders and fascinates those who stay, because it's really alive and it's changing all the time. And so why does any of this matter, especially to
Culture and
someone
society.
from Austin or Alberta or Manchester?
happens.
Why does this matter? Because the story of Europe is still the story of the West. It was European thinkers who exported ideas like rationalism, nationalism, capitalism. It was European wars that shaped the current world order that we have today.
Yes.
And it's European integration that set the template for post-war peace, and European disintegration that signals its potential
It's true.
unraveling. And so when Europe struggles with its identity, it reveals cracks in the broader Western psyche. And so Europe is
Wow.
often the first place where cultural tremors are felt. The rise of the far right, the backlash against globalism, the decline of religion, the loneliness epidemic, the bureaucratic bloat, these are not just European stories, they are canaries in the coal mine of modern liberal democracies. What happens in Sweden's elections, in Poland's courts, or on the French streets during a pension protest ripples far beyond the borders of Europe.
Yes.
And so, you know, I have a tendency to go a little too deep with these topics. But if you're American, this might seem like overthinking, but in Europe, identity is largely inherited. It's not chosen. Like, we don't really have anything like the American dream. And whether you believe that the American dream is dead or alive, the fact that that idea exists is incredible. And so if you really want to understand Europe, you can't stop at croissants in Paris or castles in Bavaria. You really have to go deeper and
This is
ask deeper
superficial.
questions, like, where do the Balkans begin and end? Why do some Poles bristle at being called Eastern European? What does it mean to be European in a world where global power is shifting to the East? And perhaps the most important question of all, can a continent built on division ever find unity without losing its soul? That's really the tension that defines Europe. And
Yes.
it's the reason why understanding it matters now
It's a hard
more
question.
than ever before. If you're American or British or from anywhere else across the world, I highly encourage you to come and visit some European countries. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of you. Take it easy, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Yeah, I think like this was a very interesting video. Very like he went on really on like an on-depth explanation because yes, I think like from sort of like the superficial sort of like look, you can say, oh, but you know what is Europe? It's like, well, it's a continent and it has like 40 countries and well 44, I think, like around 40 countries, and you know you would say, well, that's it. But it's like, no, and that you would have asked me like before this video, and probably that would have been like what I was thinking. But now, obviously, when he went on the whole sort of like explanation of like, yeah, but one thing is like for you to actually say like, what is Europe like in what sense? Like geographically, like culturally, socially, like there's like so many things that I'm like, oh yeah, now you got a great point. Yes, I'm thinking of like probably the geographical sort of like standpoint of it's a continent, and yes, you know, it's like it's the whole thing, that whole landmass like across the Atlantic. But yes, you know, it's hard because when he went on like really in depth, it's like is it though? Like yes, of course, like I think a lot of like probably I don't know if like a lot of people, but I think like the sort of like the notion that you sort of like equal, like, oh, Europe is sort of equal to the European Union. I think that's really a mistake that a lot of people I think have in their brains and probably like do. Like I don't know, because it's like, well, it's the European Union, and again, it's like he said, it's probably like the biggest organization like in the it's an organization. Can I say it's an organization? It's like the biggest sort of like project that exists in, you know, in of that capacity and of that scale in the world. So you know, it is like, I think a lot of people are. I think like, yeah, you can say, oh, you know, when I think of like Europe, I think of the European Union. But like it's not that really. I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the European Union, you're excluding like a bunch of other countries that are technically part of Europe, right? If you're thinking geographically. So it is like, yeah, well, sure, that's a great point. Yes, of course. So it is like, I don't know, like it's really hard actually. Like it isn't as easy as you would think. Like, because it's like, oh no, isn't it like an easy answer? Yes, Europe, like it's that. No, it's really hard. And that's not even like not to get into like the whole political aspect of it all, of the whole, yes, you know, a lot of countries like they want to belong to the EU, some of them are want to leave, well, just the UK. So if the UK sort of like, you know, they left the European Union, but it's like, so do they just stop being Europe? Well, no, because like you're the whole like island like is just there, like you're not moving the island. So yeah, politically it changes things, and you're not part of the European Union, but you're still European. Like that's not going to change, you know, the whole cultural baggage, the whole obviously the whole again geographical location. Although I do understand that every case is like so particular, because specifically like in the sense of like the UK, they have like a whole, and I don't think that's new actually, or maybe it is actually, I have no idea. But I've really gotten the sense like in the past that Europeans, and this is even before they left the EU, that they didn't really saw themselves as European. I don't really know why, like, but that was just like the sense that I had. I don't know if it's just because they're like, is it because they're separated and it's all like mainland Europe? Is that it? Because for them, I would think a lot of people, they had a tendency of being like, oh, like Europe, oh, over there in Europe, but it's like you are part of Europe. But I think maybe for them, like they saw themselves, or they see themselves as probably like more different than the other countries, and that's why they see it as the other, and it's like the others that are over there. But for the rest of the world, of course, it's going to be different, because we are more sort of like more separated from the UK and of course like Europe itself. So it's like you are part of Europe, because to me, like you're part of that same category. But if you're inside of that whole category, maybe you're able to see like the little differences, and you're able to like separate yourself and see like, no, it's something totally different. So I think maybe that's where it comes, like the whole, like that's where it comes from, of like they see themselves as very different, that for the rest of the world is like, you're not, you're still European. So maybe that's it. But I think that I've always found it very interesting. It's like they didn't really sell themselves as European, although technically they were. But also I think for a lot of things, they are like, no, you are part of like, you're still European. So it's kind of crazy to me, like they sort of like saw themselves as like, no, not really. But also, when it comes to like something like Russia, for instance, I think I've always, you know, Russia I think is like a whole separate subject. Yes, it's part in Asia, part in Europe. Do they see themselves as European? I have no idea. I don't think I've ever like I don't really know like Russian people enough or Russian identity to actually like see what they think. But I for others, and I could understand, of course, that you get into the whole like cultural and historical baggage that a lot of other European countries, especially those in the EU, and not even those in the EU, just a lot of people, because of course the whole Russia situation, the whole historically, they don't want to be seen as that. So they're like, no, of course they're not European, but it's like, yeah, but like half of the country is like over there. So how would you say like, no, it isn't? So I can, and I understand it. Like, of course, it's completely like, I understand both sides of being, if they want to like participate and they want to be seen as European, yes, I understand why. But I also understand why Europeans wouldn't want to be seen as sort of like associated with them. So it is, yes, it's all, everyone has like their viewpoint, and it's like, it's valid. I do understand where this is coming from. So the whole Russia thing, for instance, is kind of crazy. It's like, yeah, well, are they? I wouldn't, yes, but I don't know. And Turkey, like, don't even get me started on Turkey. I'm like, for me, Turkey, personally, I do not think it's European. I don't know, maybe European enough. I don't know if that sounds offensive, but I don't really think they're sort of like European enough, just again because culturally and just I know historically they bet, yeah, it's part of Europe and it's part of like Europe's culture and history, especially in certain parts. But I don't know, like in this, like again, this day and age, like should Turkey like belong? Like should you call Turkey Europe? I personally, I wouldn't think so, because again, I think that like the separation is like way too big. They're way too different. But who knows? Again, that's just my perspective. I'm not, I'm not like a social political expert, so I wouldn't know. So like my 2 cents, it's like no, not really, but I know that it seems weird to me to actually consider Turkey like Europe. Although again, I understand why you would think so, but I don't know, maybe again that's my own bias, and I'm like, yeah, maybe it's the whole thing about the UK. I'm like, I consider the UK Europe, but you can make it maybe like make the same case for like Turkey. It's like, well, if you think the UK is Europe, like why wouldn't you think Turkey is Europe? So again, maybe it's my own bias, and it goes to show that yes, every single person is going to have like their own perspective depending on their own biases, and they're going to be thinking about things like a little bit different. And the Balkans, that's a whole like other can of worms. I know I do not know enough like history to actually go in depth about them. I do know that it's politically it's been like a very fraught situation. They've had a lot of wars like historically. It's a whole. I have to admit, I don't really know like what the wars were. Like I do know they've changed borders like a bunch, and they've separated. Like I think like the countries have gone, like the countries have have disappeared, and they've had they've probably like separated the country, and now they're one thing and they're another. Like Yugoslavia, like that's not that it wasn't, and now it's a different thing. And I know that you have like Albania, like there's like a lot of like there's a bunch of other countries that have, again, it's like a very fraught political situation. I do know that it's just like historically it's a whole thing, and it's been around for like the conflicts have been around for like hundreds and probably thousands of years. I have to admit I do not understand the conflict, because I do know and the wars historically, what was like the actual reason for the conflict. I don't really know enough about it to actually to form an opinion or something, because again, I don't know like the actual reasoning behind the wars and the conflicts. But I do understand, and I do know that it's a whole, like it's a very sensitive subject for a lot of them, and it's like, yeah, you shouldn't, like it's a bit of a minefield, and you should be like very respectful in order to like not be offensive, because again, everyone's going to have their own perspective, of course. But I know that there's like a lot of countries that like recognize each other because of the whole cultural baggage that they have, and historically and whatever. So it's like I wouldn't know. I didn't even know why they were called the Balkans. It's like, oh, okay, I understand it now. But to me, I think it was weird, because if you saw it, like the map that he was showing us, like apparently like Greece should technically be on there, and I'm like, I think like Greece is not the Balkans. Like to me, Greece is sort of like the Mediterranean. So again, it's like it's crazy. And when I was like watching the video, I was like, I can really see, because again, when it first started, I was like, I don't think, well, yeah, or if you're explaining to me, I'm like, it sounds like it sounds complicated, because it actually is, again, because depending on like so many things. But before this, I would have been like, I don't know, it's not that hard. Like, I don't know, to me it's this, but no, it goes to show that yes, there's like so many like different like elements and particularities that people actually, some people may think a certain way and others in another. So it is hard. It's actually harder than it looks. It's like, what is Europe? Like, it's the easy answer. It's like, think again, not really. And not to go, like, again, and Eastern Europe, yes, Eastern Europe, I know what you mean when you talk about, like, the Eastern Europe, which I think is, like, seen as a negative thing, which I think I find quite sad, actually. And I can see, yes, I know that, like, yeah, people do not want to be seen as part of that, and there's a cultural thing of, like, we do not want to be seen as Eastern Europe. But it's like, if you ask me, like, I would say Poland, like, maybe not culturally, but I think it is they have a lot of, like, Slavic influence, so I would assume, yes, it is a little bit of, like, Eastern Europe, right? So again, it's a whole thing, and it's like so many, like, different things that it's a bit of a minefield just to, like, navigate all this, because it's like, it is very hard, and it just depends on who you ask and what you're talking about. You're talking geographically, you're talking politically, you're talking historically, and again, borders change, and society, like, is constantly evolving and is constantly changing. So what is seen as something right now, maybe in 20 years, 30 years, is going to be seen as something else. So it is, and it's okay. Like, that's just the nature of things. Things are constantly changing. So it is, and you would expect, well, it's a country, like, it shouldn't actually change. But no, absolutely, yes. Nations and continents, like, are constantly they're also shifting. The borders, not the land masses themselves, although those change as well. But the whole, again, like, the political situation, like, changes things and changes borders. So it is, it is like, yes, it's constantly changing. And I do really, like, it is important, because again, Europe is, like, the birth, like, that's where, like, the birth of, like, a lot of things, like he said, like, the birth of, like, the civilization. Not, again, it's, like, a little bit grandiose of me to say, but as a lot of, yes, because of the Europe's, like, influence in all over the world, not just America, like, in the whole world, because obviously they went on and conquered, like, so many other parts of the world. Their influence, like, it has been felt, and it's gonna, and yes, not anymore, people are independent, but a lot of things, like he said, a lot of the political movements, like, start over there, and you would think, like, things do not really exist in a vacuum. So that's where, like, that's what you should be paying attention. It's like, yes, you should be paying attention, because it's like something you would say, oh, but why would I care what happens in, like, I don't know, some, city in Austria? I mean, technically, I think, like, you would care, because again, we're all humans, but in the grand, like, scheme of things, like, you would think, oh, why would I care if, like, this is happening over there? Like, it's millions and millions of, like, miles away. But he's like, no, he makes a great point. He's like, yes, because historically, Europe has been, like, it birthed, like, all the ideas that eventually, like, made it over to the rest of the world, and just ideas, concepts, political systems, and just, like, everything else. So it is, like, that's what you should be paying attention. You don't really know, like, the influence that's going to have, and then you're thinking, again, what would I care about what happens in Austria? It's like, well, in 100 years, like, maybe people would have been like, we should be paying, like, more attention to what was happening in Austria 100 years ago, because, like, all the influence sort of, like, trickles down and goes and widens, and again, it's like that, it happens over there, and then it happens all over Europe, and then it, like, makes it across the Atlantic, and that's where it goes. Especially, again, in these days, like, the internet and sort of, like, globalization, like, makes it so that everyone eventually, like, the influence is, like, far reaching. So that's why you should be paying attention. And the whole thing about, like, is it Europe? Yes, and it makes it a little bit harder, because, like, each country has their own language, their own cultural, their own, like, history. So it makes it hard, and it's hard to actually, I think, maintaining sort of, like, an identity as a European, as in, like, the macro of it all, of, like, yes, I'm European, but also maintaining that integrity, that identity, as in, like, my own country, like, I'm Polish. So it's like, yes, I'm Polish, and that how relates to the European identity, and how, because again, and what does it mean to be European if each country has their own, like, little things, and again, because they have, like, different values. So it is hard to actually, how do I relate to both of them at the same time, if both things or even or more things are in conflict, because it doesn't really, my European identity is sort of, like, separate from my Polish identity. I don't know, like, it really is a really on-depth subject, and I don't think there's no easy answers. It's like, yes, this could be debated, like, for like so long, and I don't think like we can agree on something, or because again, it's like it's really it is a really hard subject that is like a lot, like we can talk about this for like 4 hours. But that was it for today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.